Power, however, is very objective. I mean, it is what it is. You can either do it or you cannot. Regardless of what your heart rate or your rate of perceived exertion is, power is basically constant.
That Triathlon Show, episode 38. Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. As always, I'm your host, Michael, and on today's episode, I have somebody with me for the interview from a company that I admire a lot, and I'm a big advocate of their product. It's Trainerroad. I mentioned it in the past. It's a software for indoor bike training, power-based bike training, but you don't need a power meter. You can get by just with a cheap cadence and speed sensor to get a virtual power and reap all the benefits of power-based training, which we'll go into in more detail on the interview. Anyway, one thing that I want to make sure that I mention is that I'm not in any way affiliated with Trainerroad, but part of my goal with this podcast is to bring you information about products and other things, services that I love and use myself. And they have helped me in my triathlon development. And I hope that by bringing awareness about these great products to you, I can help some of you have that same kind of development and by using those products. So another one that I've been promising to bring you an update on is Stride, the running power meter. I won't give you a big update now, but suffice it to say that I absolutely love the Stride running power meter, at least as much as I expected to be honest. And I had high expectations for it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have bought it. But it's been fantastic. In my latest race, which was the Northwest Island Games on Gotland, Sweden, this past weekend, by the time of this recording, at the end of June, I had a very tough running course, or we all had, and I had a really, really great run, my best triathlon run ever, I would say, on a very tough course with a long 1+ kilometer climb. And the Stride running power meter was fantastic to keep me in check on that run, and it helped me then blast past people on those flats and the downhill sections of the course just by preserving my energy a bit and distributing my power more evenly than most other competitors did. So I think I advanced from by at least 12 positions and was one of the fastest running times in that race, which was pretty competitive. So I was very happy with that. And the Stride running power meter has been something that I've been really enjoying. And a bigger update is to follow at a later stage, but some of you have been asking about that already, so I thought I wanted to give you a short update. Anyway, that's enough of an intro. Let's meet Chad Timmerman, head coach of Trainerroad, and talk about effective power-based cycling training. Enjoy. All right, on today's interview on That Triathlon Show, we have Chad Timmerman, who is the head coach of Trainerroad, as our guest. Welcome to the show, Chad.
Thank you, Mikhail. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So can you fill the listeners in first on who you are, and then we'll move on to Trainerroad, what that is and what you can do with that?
Sure. I'm the head coach for Trainerroad. I've been coaching athletes since a little over 11 years now. And then as I've also been an endurance athlete in some form or another since about 1995, so a little over 20 years now.
And Trainerroad is the company that you work at, and what do you do exactly?
I am the head coach at Trainerroad. So I'm one of the two founding members, and I also basically helm everything that has to do with conditioning or workout programming or creating of training plans, anything along those lines.
Yeah, perfect. And I've mentioned Trainerroad several times on this podcast before, so some listeners may be familiar with it. I actually know that some listeners have talked about using Trainerroad themselves, which I do as well for my training. And it's a software that you can use for cycling training indoors with a trainer and train with power, effective training, basically. And you get different workouts that you can choose from entire training plans that Chad put together. And we'll have some links and also some screenshots in the show notes, put things out there so that people can have a look at that. And if you have some video that you can send us about how it all works, then that would be great as well. But
Sure.
Yeah, perfect. So, but essentially one thing that I want to make clear to the listeners, because some people might think that it's not for them because you train with power. I just mentioned that, but you don't need a power meter, do you, to use Trainerroad?
No, it's not necessary. So we have something called virtual power, which is our proprietary method of basically calculating your power based on the trainer that you're using, the speed to power curve for each individual trainer.
Yeah, and they're pretty accurate. And anyway, if they're not exactly on point, then it's still consistent from day to day in your own training. Yeah,
exactly right.
So essentially, the investment that you're looking at if you want to get started training with power is the cost of a speed sensor and a cadence sensor and the Trainerroad itself.
That's about right, yep.
Yep, and that it would be, just to fill the listeners in, I think that when I started, I bought that for €60 for the speed and cadence sensor, and Trainerroad is, I believe, $10, $11 per month or something like that.
$12 per month, or I think our annual is...
$99.
Yeah, I could be wrong. We think it's $90.
Yeah. So it's very cheap, and it's probably one of the best investments that I've made for sure, because now I use a power meter as well. So even when I'm training outside, I can train with power. But this was my first foray into training with power when starting with Trainerroad, and definitely it makes a massive difference, the amount of preciseness that you can have in your training and how much you can develop your fitness through that. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about why training with power is so effective and preferable to any other thing that you can train by.
Sure. And basically our metrics are RPE, so rate of perceived exertion, heart rate, and then power. And our RPE is super useful, but it has to be built on a basis of experience. So you have to have a lot of experience with training in general. So RPE comes along with time, but it's kind of a hard thing to establish. Heart rate is subjective. It just changes based on far too many variables for the training load to be consistent. For us to prescribe workouts based on heart rate, we run into a lot of issues. Day-to-day fluctuations, athlete-to-athlete fluctuations, all the things that can affect heart rate. Power, however, is very objective. I mean, it is what it is. You can either do it or you cannot. Regardless of what your heart rate or your rate of perceived exertion is, power is basically constant. So when we assess fitness and we get an idea of what you can do, and we base everything on what's called functional threshold power, or basically our power, or your max lactate steady state, once we get a feel for that, we can scale all the workouts accordingly, and then basically reassess and then rescale.
Yeah, and so essentially you get the prescription of workouts based on that percentage. So if you have an FTP of, let's say, 200 watts, then your workouts will look like something like that. You warm up at a certain percentage, maybe 50% of your FTP, and then you have some intervals that are at some other percentage, let's say, for argument's sake, 90%. So that would be at 180 watts. So the same workout can be applied to any athlete, regardless of their fitness ability, because you work on those percentages of FTP and work the same energy systems that way. So, as you mentioned, you have a ton of workouts. How many workouts do you have inside of Trainerroad?
I stopped counting, but I'm pretty sure the workout catalog is somewhere, it's well over 1,000. I know that, probably closer to 1,300 or 1,400 workouts.
Yeah. And the training plans that you have there are a lot of them as well, but you have training plans for triathletes specifically. So let's start talking about that. You have for all the different distances, but also different phases of the season.
Exactly. So we break it down in a number of ways. First off, we periodize based on a traditional periodization model. So we'll start with base, and then we move to build conditioning, and then we move to specialty training. And then within that, I have broken these down into disciplines. So sprint, triathlon, Olympic, and then half distance and full distance. And then even within that, I break it down even further based on the amount of training time you have to dedicate each week. So there's a low volume, a mid volume, and a high volume version of all of those plans.
Yeah. Okay, that's perfect. And let's start with the periodization, the base, build, and specialty. What distinguishes those different phases from each other?
Basically, it just gets, we're building more general fitness and then working towards very specific fitness. So in the earlier phases, in the base phases, you'll see things that are more about building work capacity. And then the build phase basically grows that work capacity. And then when we get to the specialty phase, we start to hone the fitness to make it really specific to the types of events. So if you're doing a sprint, you're going to see very different training in that specialty phase than you would during or than you would compared to, say, like a half Ironman or an Ironman specialty phase. But when you're back in the base phase, you'll see a lot of overlap between the 4 different events.
Yeah, so let's dive a bit deeper into that. So what would the base phase look like? If that's fairly similar to all, so let's start talking about that just broadly, regardless of distance.
Sure. Yeah, so the big concern is fostering aerobic capacity. And most of the training plans, especially if you're indoor, it's kind of assumed that you don't have a ton of time to play with. So you can go about building that aerobic capacity with short, hard efforts that really tax the aerobic system, or you can do the whole long, slow approach. But the long, slow approach assumes that you have a heck of a lot of time. Most of our athletes don't. And even if they do, there's still a lot of benefit to be garnered from using those shorter, harder efforts. And then within, say, the sprint versus the half Ironman, there might be small discrepancies, but we're still mostly concerned with fostering those basics, that aerobic base, some muscular strength, and pretty heavy emphasis on form work.
What are a couple of example workouts that you would do within this period?
Depending on the phase or on the discipline, there's typically some VO2 max work. So some short 2 and 3 minute efforts at anywhere from 110, 115, even 120% of that functional threshold power. And then there'll be something that's a little more dedicated toward muscular endurance. So sweet spot work right around 90% of threshold. And those will be longer efforts, maybe ranging probably from about 6 minutes. And in the base phase, they could grow as high as maybe 15 minutes. I don't know if we get up into 20s quite so early.
Yeah, and that's for intervals. And then you also have those long rides are generally quite a long time, just around about that sweet spot intensity for a long duration.
Yeah, so those longer rides, we might cut it down even a little below sweet spot and put it more in the endurance range, which is anywhere from about 60 to 80% threshold typically.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. I seem to remember some, but yeah, they were still below sweet spot, but around that higher end of the endurance, so maybe 80, whereas sweet spot would be the 85 to 90%. Anyway, they seem fairly hard. Let's put it like this, the general consensus among many cyclists is that the long ride will be a 4 or 5 hour ride on a Sunday, but your long rides in the base phase are not like that. They can be 90 minutes and then have a fairly high intensity, that's 80% or 75% or something like that of FTP, so that you still...
Exactly. Yeah, we assume, or I assume, that people don't necessarily want to spend long periods of time when they're indoors. So we kind of compensate by nudging up the intensity a little bit. And there's always an option of heading outdoors and doing longer work, slower work, and try to accumulate that high mileage. But again, the assumption is that athletes don't have a ton of time to dedicate to training. And if they do, good for them. They can always substitute any workout that, should their schedule allow it, they can make substitutions.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. I get tons of emails from athletes saying that they're short on time, but I don't remember getting a single email where an athlete has said that I have a lot of time. What should I do with this extra time that I have?
Right.
Okay, so what about the build phase then, when we get a bit further into the season? This is where it starts to diverge a bit more between the different goal race distances, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, so again, we're still assuming there's a bit of a restriction on training time, so there'll still be some focus on high intensity work. And I think high intensity work has a place year round. You can always sprinkle some in a little more heavily depending on the discipline, but this is where if, say, you're doing a sprint versus full Ironman, you might see short VO2 max efforts in the sprint plan, longer VO2 max efforts, and maybe fewer of them in the full distance plan. In any case, it becomes a little more similar, but the big emphasis here is on increasing the overall training load. So trying to raise basically muscular endurance and aerobic capacity. I mean, that's the two fundamentals of triathlon racing, is to have a big aerobic engine, but be able to push at a high percentage of that aerobic engine's capacity.
Yeah, so you mentioned they're increasing training load. So let's talk a bit about the volume of the plans. You have the low, mid, and high volume. So what kind of volumes are we talking about for these? And this is the cycling component only that we're talking about, of course.
Sure. The low volume plans are 3 days a week. So it's like a Tuesday, Thursday, and then a Saturday. And they're all interval workouts. So again, we're trying to maximize training time. Once you move up to the mid volume plans, those will grow to 4, sometimes or quite often 5 days on the bike a week. And then the high volume plan adds that 6th day, giving, always leaving at least 1 day for rest. And then the triathlon plans actually do incorporate swim and run workouts. They're not, they are structured, but they're not as measurable as training with power. So we have to base the run workouts on RPE and pace, swim workouts entirely based on time.
Yeah. Okay. And this is something that's worth mentioning as well, that yes, you can, when you sign up for Trainerroad and you get those entire training plan libraries. I haven't used the triathlon plans in their entirety myself, but I've had a good look at them, and they look like really great places to start if you for general triathlon plans. So that's something that's worth considering, that you don't get just the cycling workouts and cycling plans. Okay, so going back to the different phases, we're now past our... And also, one more question, by the way, before getting into the specialty phase. How long are these different phases? How long is the base, and then the build, and then the specialty?
Yeah, pretty typically, the base phase is typically 12. The build is typically 8, and then the specialty is typically 8. The triathlon plans differ a bit because we have the 4 disciplines. So I made the assumption that people training for a sprint triathlon often enough are new athletes. Maybe they don't have, either way, they don't need a full, while they could use a full 12 weeks of training, they maybe don't have that sort of time to dedicate. So they're a little bit accelerated, and that jumps up a little bit, such that, and this is only a difference in the base phase. Actually, maybe that carries. It's been a while since I developed these plans, but in any case, the sprint plan is a little more accelerated than typical. The Olympic plan, not quite as accelerated, but a little truncated, and then we fall back into that whole 28-week span for both the half and the full distance plans.
Right. Okay. So now, finally, let's talk about the specialty phase. Those final weeks of the entire build up to a race. So what goes into the specialty phase?
So those are when it's very specific, and this is where you'll see the biggest differences between the different disciplines. So again, I use sprint and full distance because they're both the opposite ends of the spectrum. But the sprint workouts will, it's still very much aerobic work. This is an aerobic sport. We're not running 400 meters around a track and calling it a day. You're still going to be out there for, in the ballpark of an hour for a sprint, and then, half a day for a full distance race. But even though it's very much aerobic, those the demands placed on the body are quite a bit different when you're competing for an hour versus 10 hours, and the workouts reflect that.
So what are some examples that we see in this training phase for example, for the sprint and the full distance plan?
So the sprint, the intensity, the implied intensity for the bike, or the assumed intensity for the bike, is going to hover around your functional threshold power, maybe even a little above it. So you'll see intervals where you'll work at 98% up to 105% for a few minutes at a time. The rest becomes minimal because we're trying to grow your capability to maintain that intensity for what's going to amount to the entire bike leg. Whereas when you look at the full distance triathlons, that's a much different intensity level. You're going to be out on the bike from anywhere from 4.5 to 7-8 hours in some cases. In which case you're going to be working at a much lower percentage of threshold. So you'll see efforts, intervals, longer intervals, but the intensity will tone down to maybe 85, 80, 75% of FTP.
Yeah, and what about the total volume in this part of the season in the specialty phase? Does it stay the same or decrease or?
No, this is where it trims down, and these are. So basically the build phase, the volume is relatively high, but then it grows during the build phase. And then once we step back down once we move forward into the specialty phase, the overall volume declines a bit.
Yeah. Okay. And it's worth mentioning here that this is not just some sort of formula that Trainerroad has come up with or Chad has come up with in their plans, but it's based on exercise science and well backed by research, this kind of approach to training. And we talked about this in other episodes as well, but this gives you a good example of how the bike training specifically works within this periodization model. So is there anything in particular that you find that athletes tend to do the most differently before signing up for, or what's the biggest change that athletes see when they start training according to your training plans in Trainerroad compared to before?
Sure. I think there's not much of a disparity between their training intensities. I think most of them just go out and train kind of medium hard all the time. where I try to push the point that it's vital that there's a big difference between your easy days and your hard days. So all those interval workouts, basically, so your Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday sort of structure, those workouts hurt. I mean, they're very demanding. They ask a lot of the body, and therefore they require a lot of recovery. So it's important that on the other days that workload is offset with proper recovery. So those workouts are intentionally very easy, or they're rest days.
Yeah, and that's something that definitely I can attest to, that they are hard workouts. But then again, when you really nail them, then it gives you such a great feeling of accomplishment when you get through those workouts. And when I first started on Trainerroad, I mean, I'm no stranger to training hard or having that polarized approach, but still some of those VO2 max workouts, when you go up to 27 minutes in total, I think is the most that I've been to. It's still something that was way beyond what I had ever done before and thought beyond my capabilities. But these plans will teach you how to push yourself beyond what you thought possible. And obviously that's how you can grow your fitness and expand that. So that's great. And one other thing that I think is great with many of the workouts that you have is that you actually have those sort of cues, like subtitles to the workouts, essentially, that you've written with advice. Sometimes it's form advice, sometimes it's mental advice, and those sorts of things that keep you pushing and not just looking at that power number. So
yeah, that's actually one of my favorite aspects of the workouts, and I wish I could dedicate more time to doing it, but it's actually pretty time consuming. But that's the one way that I can kind of maintain a direct link with each of the riders. Because I started this where I would work with individual riders, and I got to say all that stuff, out loud, verbally. Now I have to convey it in a different means because I'm dealing with far many more athletes. So, and that's my way to do it. So it's kind of a bit of a tether between me as a coach and them as a coached athlete.
Yeah. And there's a lot of things to be learned for sure from them. It's just conveyed in a very, very well-written way, that it's simple, it's short, to the point, but you get the point across very well. So I think that's one of my favorite parts of the software as well. Anything else that you want to mention about Trainerroad as a software and as a tool for triathlon training?
I will say that we're right now working on the incorporation of outdoor rides. So this is something that you can expect to see in the reasonably near future, where you can take all your ride data from outdoor rides, and of course this assumes you have a power meter, but you can actually lump that into our career page, and you can track your metrics more easily, whether they're indoor or outdoor.
Yep, and what's your general take on indoor versus outdoor training, by the way? Let's
obviously, I'm a big proponent of indoor training. I think the quality, the ability to maintain high quality is unprecedented. I mean, you can't really match it with an outdoor ride. You can on occasion, but you can't do it as consistently. And if you don't have a power meter, or virtual power offers you the opportunity to train more objectively, regardless. And it's like I said, it's just higher quality training. So all the obstacles and distractions that you encounter on an outdoor ride are basically removed. So it's almost a direct focus on quality and not much else.
Yeah,
that does leave some wiggle room. I mean, I don't encourage people to, or I don't require people to simply train indoors. I recognize that we're doing all this so that we can compete and enjoy ourselves outdoors as well. So I recognize that people, even if they're strictly following a training plan, still want to get outdoors. And this is why we offer the option on those lower intensity rides, those less structured rides, to actually do so, to get outside.
Yeah, and I'll chime in with my personal opinion that it's definitely a must for triathletes to train outside sometime and try to do those race-specific workouts outside as well, because it's a bit different to try to push the power outdoors compared to indoors. But definitely when you're trying to increase your FTP and your aerobic capacity and increase the physiological aspects of your cycling, then indoor training is, as you say, unprecedented, because you can just do that without any interruptions. So that's my take on it. Mostly indoors for all those physiological adaptations, but some race specificity is also needed, in my opinion, outdoors.
Perfectly stated.
Yeah. Okay. Glad that we're on the same page. Okay. So you're also, I want to try to dig a little bit into the science here, because you follow what happens in exercise science pretty rigorously, and you talk about that quite a lot on your podcast, which you guys at Trainerroad has, which is the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast. Anything that has come up recently that you have found interesting, or in general, or just want to share with listeners?
Right now we're kind of the hot topic, and pun intended, is basically the outdoor temperature. So we're dealing with a lot of athletes who spend a lot of time indoors in a cool environment, and then they go and compete outdoors, and they're not heat acclimated. So we're really going to start pushing that science in the very next podcast. I think we've touched on it already, but it's a big topic. And what's particularly interesting about it is all the other physiological adaptations that come with it. So you don't just get better at dealing with heat, but you actually improve fitness and improve aerobic capacity. And there's a lot of other upsides to this, what's termed hyperthermic training. So that's one thing that we're particularly keen on right now. Another, and it's certainly not a new topic, but is emphasis on the quality of sleep. And we're trying to find ways to basically maximize our recovery during that very specific downtime during sleep.
Yeah, cool. And those are topics that we've covered on the show for the interested listener. Sleep with Matt Dixon in episode 10, I believe, and also episode 28 with Brad Stolberg. And then heat acclimation, it's something that we haven't talked about yet, but definitely something that I'm looking to get some expert on the show in the future. I posted about it on Facebook, calling it the new altitude training, because it seems to be picking up so much in popularity, and also the evidence is piling up that it's actually hugely beneficial. So that's very interesting. Good points. Let's dive into some rapid fire questions. So What's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to triathlon or cycling?
So for triathlon, it's funny you just mentioned Matt Dixon. I really like his well-built triathlete book. I'm a big fan of Jim Vance as well. So I think it's Triathlon 2.0, Triathlon Science. He's got a lot of really good resources. And then when it comes to cycling, basically I follow the same guys. It's Matt Fitzgerald, Andrew Coggin. I mean, the kind of the heavy hitters, as it were, in the basically the endurance sports realm, but especially cycling. Yeah.
What's your favorite piece of gear or equipment?
I have to differentiate. I mean, indoors, it's my Wahoo kicker. Outdoors, it's kind of the bike of the week. Right now I bounce back and forth between my Yeti, which is an SB 4.5, and my road bike, which is a Trek Domani SLR disc.
And finally, what's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
Probably prioritizing my sleep and then coupling that with an early rise time.
Yep, and you've been up already for a couple of hours, and it's 8 a.m. your time. It was 6 a.m. that you got into work. Yeah, that's good. So when do you go to sleep then?
Typically, I'm in bed somewhere between 8 and 9, and I find it pretty difficult to sleep past 4:30 in the morning.
Okay, yeah. Well, that if you can wake up without an alarm, that's definitely something that proves that you have gotten all sleep you need in most cases. And I'm sure that you are aware if you have that or not. That's all that I have. Is there anything else that you want to mention or talk about? Where can the listeners find out more about you or about Trainerroad?
It's just trainerroad.com. And then we also have a blog at blog.trainerroad.com.
Yeah, it's very good. I recommend the listeners go there, and I'll have the links in the show notes. You also have a video that I want to mention, since you didn't bring that up, with your fundamental training principles, and also an email series that is also very informational. So those will all be linked up to in the show notes. All right. Thank you so much, Chad, for being on the show, and all the best for the continued development of Trainerroad and the training plans, and also for your own cycling goals and adventures, which I'm always interested in hearing about on your podcast, which I'm listening to a lot.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for having me, Mikhail. It was a pleasure.
Okay, no problem. Talk to you later. Bye. All right. Hope you enjoyed that interview with Chad. Thank you so much to Chad for taking the time to come on the interview. It's funny because it feels like I know Chad just by doing so many of his workouts and seeing those subtitles and those instructions and cues, and that are obviously his handwriting all over, and doing that all winter essentially, and having him coach me remotely through those training sessions. So it was great to finally be able to talk to Chad and catch up. Also, of course, as I mentioned, I listen to the Trainerroad podcast, the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast, regularly. So I think that my main takeaways, as Chad said, I think I agree with everything. Effective training, indoor training, is so time effective for most age group triathletes that it's something that most of your training can be indoors, and you will probably reap the most benefits that way, as opposed to trying to do most of your training outdoors. I'm actually right now on a program where I do in summer all of my training outdoors, and that is by the order of my coach, so I obey. But definitely for most, I think that doing most training, I also have some flexibility in my time schedule, although I'm very busy, but I have some flexibility, which helps. So that's indoor training is key, and power-based training definitely, because especially if you are a very experienced athlete, yes, RPE works. Heart rate, as I talked about before in, for example, episode 29, training zones for cycling, heart rate zones don't work, not if you're trying to do intense intervals. And then you're left with power zones if you're not confident enough that you're in tune with your body enough to go completely by RPE. If you go by power, I mean, you will find probably that if you do use Trainerroad, that you will be able to push yourself past limits that you never thought possible. That's what I found, at least, which makes it worth the investment alone, that just pushing those limits, those boundaries that you have. So that's about it. Again, go check it out. You can sign up for a month for $12 or whatever it is, and see if it's for you. And that will definitely be something that I think most of you will find very useful and help you train more effectively. And that's one of the core principles of this podcast and of Scientific Triathlon, to try to impart knowledge about how to train effectively. And Trainerroad is plays a massive part for me in training effectively myself. So I'm glad to have got this episode out. Finally, I have a listener question that I want to answer that's unanswered for quite some time, but I'm getting to it now, so sorry. This question is sent by Eva Liedman from I don't know where, but she's 50 years old, she's female, and her question is how to structure my training. I train 8 to 12 hours each week, but do I do the right things at the right time? My goal is to qualify for Kona. I've been in triathlon for 5 years, and this is my 3rd year as an Ironman competitor. Where I can improve the most is my running, then in cycling. I swim under 1 hour 10 minutes already in Ironman races, and I hope to reach 1 hour 5 minutes this summer, so that is now, but as I said, this has been in my backlog for quite some time, so there's not much I can improve on the swimming side. And again, this is sent by Eva Liedman. So what I answered to her was that obviously this is going to be quite a kind of a generic answer because I don't have all the information, but based on what she's writing about her goals and her athletic and demographic attributes, I would try to improve the running, which is what she can improve the most, not by increasing volume, because she's an older athlete and she's a female as well. So running can be really taxing and risky for that kind of athlete if you do it a lot. But by doing just a little, but doing very high quality running, I think that you can get all those benefits. And also possibly, if you can, incorporating strength training, weight training, that is. So anyway, increasing volume, it's a necessary risk for not enough potential benefit on the run side of things. But where you can increase volume is on the bike to get super fit on that, which will also help you run faster off the bike. And you still do quite a bit of quality on the bike, just as we just talked about with Chad, because you're on 10 to 11, 12 hours per week. So there is room for quality, even though the volume is not going to be big enough that it's prohibitive of doing any sort of quality. And if you have to choose between the two, for more advanced athletes like you, intensity is always going to be what wins, not volume, when you get to that more advanced stage, for sure. So I sent Eva, came up with a framework for a week that she might be able to use, and that is a rest day on Monday. I'm a big proponent of always having a rest day each week. Then Tuesday would be a 45-minute quality swim, threshold work, for example, CSS work, as we talked about on episode 27. And then a 1 hour quality bike, maybe a VO2 max kind of bike. And then Wednesday would be a 50-minute quality run, maybe again VO2 max intervals, but on the run. First day would be a 1 hour quality swim, maybe endurance intervals, so slightly longer intervals. And then a 45-minute easy bike, just getting some volume in and some extra training stress, but without taxing the body too much. Friday, another bike, a 1 hour 30-minute bike with endurance focus. It could alternate and some week incorporate like sweet spot intervals, and some weeks, easier weeks, just be endurance. And then Saturday would be a 1 to 1.5 hour quality run, maybe increasing to 2 hours closer to race day. So it could include tempo work or race pace work in some weeks and then be completely an easy jog some other weeks. Or it could be something like the Squires long run that we talked about recently in my episode on 9 great workouts that you probably are not doing. So you can go and check that episode out as well. Squires long run is one that I thought about that might be applicable for you here. And then Sunday would be your long ride day. If we are sticking to this 10 to 11 hours, kind of a bit earlier in the season, further out from your goal races, it would be a 3 hour because that's all we have with the 10, 11 hour week. But then when you get closer and get up to 12, 13 hours, then 4 to 5 hours, definitely. And incorporating race intensity on some of your long rides is going to be critical as well. And, yeah, as I said, I'd highly recommend doing weight training weekly, both for injury prevention and performance benefits on the bike and the run. Some weeks, maybe you could even drop a swim because as you said, you don't have much to gain. Maybe just stick to that longer 1 hour swim with endurance intervals and drop that other shorter quality swim. So maybe, yeah, another point is that you could also be doing 10-day training cycles instead of weekly cycles. This might allow you to absorb the training better and keep injuries at bay. But the key points are that you should do as little running as possible for the maximum potential benefits. So drop volume on the run. Just get those key high-quality workouts in that will increase your fitness. And become really bike fit so that you can run well off the bike. All right, that's probably about it for this episode. Remember to subscribe to the show so that you automatically get the show when it's released. We've had a great increase in new subscribers recently. So if you are not subscribed at the moment, you can join those other subscribers and you'll be in good company. And thank you as well to everybody who's been sending me in emails. Marcelo, for example, thank you so much for your kind words about the podcast. I've answered your question in an email already, but I'll answer your question on a later podcast episode as well. That's about it for today's episode. Let me know what you think. Send me your emails with the feedback and questions, of course, to michael@scientifictriathlon.com. That's Michael with a K. And the show notes for today's episode, including all the links to Trainerroad, Chad, and some screenshots about what it looks like training with power and so on within Trainerroad, will be on thattriathlonshow.com. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.